In the past year, he had left her for that 20-year-old. For most of this time, she hadn't even crossed his mind, and he had convinced himself that he was done with her. Then he smelt something familiar that afternoon. An explosion of memories came with it, each more vivid than the last. As he turned around, he felt his heartache yearning. His eyes were drawn to her at that moment. However, she wasn't the only one. His eyes were still bleeding from the antiretroviral medication he'd taken earlier, so he took off his glasses and rubbed them against the back of his hands. It was obvious that his eyes were deceiving him. Neither of these things was happening. It was not the right time, now that everything had gone sour. While his eyes were glued to the outdoor restaurant where she sat, eating and chatting happily, he didn't realize he had stopped in the middle of the busy road. His nostrils were filled with her scent once more, and he breathed a groan. There was no way he could live without her. He heard car horns blaring around him, and his brain began to function again. The driver who was waiting for him nodded at him as he stepped off the road, an apologetic smile on his face. He was still watching her, and she was unaware of it. The aching heart in his chest stilled as he took a deep breath. His feelings were back with a vengeance which he had sworn had faded away. The outcome wouldn't be good for him in this case. Slowly, the man approached the tables and chairs outside the restaurant. He gazed back at her radiant skin and smile, illuminating them with the afternoon sun. In the back of his mind, the man was already planning ways to catch her attention. His mind had wandered to a funny one-liner when he remembered how much she loved them. However, as he approached, his attention was caught by the individual sitting beside her. A gasp escaped the man's lips. The situation was about to become even more bizarre. At that moment, Andy Sterniolo had never expected to see the woman who once snared his heart. The breakup between him and Linda Marston, the woman in question, was the worst possible. A 45-year-old Andy was left speechless when he watched her converse in the afternoon light. After burying all those feelings a year ago, all those feelings surged up to the surface like a tsunami, leaving him reeling. The story began more than a decade ago, on a sunny afternoon in town. In Andy's case, he'd just graduated from college and was looking to start a new chapter in his life. His new job in Austin, Texas was a fantastic start to his career. He had inherited a decent car from his father and lived in a small, homely apartment outside of town. Andy knew that something was missing even though his life was good. Even at the young age of 25, Andy never had luck with matters of the heart, despite having a lot figured out. Women were never his strong suit. He always stumbled when they were around. Andy had made peace with his almost non-existent love life for a while. After meeting her, he realized that all of that was about to change. Andy's eyes were drawn to her instantly. She looked like she'd descended straight from heaven onto his seat, with her long golden hair and bluest irises ever. In order to let off some steam after a long week, Andy went to a local fair with a college buddy. Andy avoided melting away or exploding when his friend introduced him to this angel made flesh. She introduced herself as Linda Marston. After working at the bakery in town and attending culinary school, she wanted to become a chef. Randy's young mind was engaged in ways he had never imagined possible, and every word that left her lips left him hankering for more. Andy knew he needed to see her again after their encounter. After that, he spent the rest of the day searching for this beautiful woman who had become everything he had ever wanted. When she eventually accepted his marriage proposal, he barely slept after their meeting. Even though he barely knew her, he laughed at the thought of offering his life to her. It didn't take Andy long to find Linda. She was fresh from her cooking classes and had started her shift when he came in. With a grin, she waved at him, calling him by name. That alone was confirmation to Andy that she was the one. He'd never known a woman other than his mom and sisters who remembered his name. He should have known that all this would end in tears. Andy had always been a timid boy. He feared awkward situations and always steered away from them. But with Linda, he was ready to brave those dark waters. He didn't care that dozens of eyes were on him. As respectfully as possible, he approached Linda and asked her on a date. He held his breath, watching as her mind worked the answer. This was make or break for him. Andy had put all his chips on the table. He was all in. But even he knew someone like Linda wouldn't go for him. He wasn't much to look at and didn't have money or status. He was just a boy smitten by one of God's greatest creations. You can imagine his surprise when she said yes. "I'd love to go out with you," she chirped in her sweet voice, the sound akin to angels singing. Andy had to ask again just to confirm he'd actually landed a date. The date was beyond successful, and 2 years later, Andy and Linda walked down the aisle as a married couple. Andy had never seen a woman as perfect as Linda, while Linda couldn't ask for a more loving and supportive partner. Andy still couldn't believe he'd married Linda. She was the gal of his dreams, his prayers made manifest. But just as he was enjoying married life, disaster struck. Andy and Linda had been married for 9 years when it happened. He'd been at work counting the hours until he went home to his beautiful wife. It had been a late rainy afternoon when he got the call. From the moment he picked it up, pressing the receiver against his ears, he knew life would never be the same. The news was terrifying. Linda had gotten in a freak accident and was currently fighting for her life in the local hospital. Would her husband please come in as soon as possible? Andy was there before the authorities finished the call. He stormed into the hospital covered in sweat, his eyes broad and his heart punching. What had happened to his beloved Linda? The authorities tried to explain the situation. A car, caught in the hefty downpour, had lost control and veered straight into the bakery where Linda worked. She'd been promoted to a chef position by that time and had only good things coming her way. But the storm, that car, and its driver had dared steal her dream away. Andy would teach them a lesson they'd never forget. Freak accident or not, Andy pressed all the charges he could. From suing the city for its bad road to the bakery owner and the driver, he went after everyone remotely close to the case. But when Linda woke up, she begged him to drop everything. No one was at fault here. This was an act of nature, and she'd take it as such. But she wasn't standing where Andy was. She wasn't looking at herself lying on the bed with her swollen limbs reinforced with metal. Andy agreed to drop the charges. He took his wife home in a wheelchair, heartbroken at what a terrible hand life had dealt them. Once a lover of rainstorms and downcast days, he now cursed every cloud that dared show its face in the sky. Linda, on the other hand, took everything in stride. The doctors had told her she'd never walked again, and she believed them. She couldn't feel anything below her waist, and that alone stood as credence to their words. She had no idea that the worst was still ahead. For months, the couple stood strong against the darkness that had enveloped them. Andy still went to work in the morning, ensuring that he could provide for his wife. On the other hand, Linda stayed at home, confined to her wheelchair. She couldn't go back to work as her boss let her go, given Randy's decision to sue her earlier. Although she didn't admit it to Randy, she felt like her life was over. Andy's life was changed forever. Slowly and gradually, his affection toward Linda started to fade away, especially after one of his coworkers got wind of his situation and decided to take advantage. The coworker, Janice, a young, beautiful brunette secretary, had always had a thing for Andy. When she heard of the terrible fate that had befallen his wife, she quickly ran over with a shoulder with his name on it. Nothing good would come out of this. Andy and Janice had long been work friends, but soon they started meeting for drinks at the bar Andy and his other work friends usually frequented. One drink too many, and Andy did the unthinkable. He went back on the vows he'd made to his wife nearly a decade past, betraying her in the worst way possible. But that wouldn't be the half of it. Andy turned his promiscuity into a habit. When he noticed his wife was starting to ask questions, he confessed. But he carried no guilt or remorse, and his mind didn't break at the tears falling down Linda's face. "I can't do anything with you," he yelled at her with livid eyes. "I want kids, a big family, and a woman who can walk." Linda couldn't even speak. Her sister came by the following day and helped her pack her things. 2 weeks later, she received divorce papers from Andy, who wanted his freedom. In tears, she arranged a meeting between them, where she begged him not to leave. "I'll get better," she wept, knowing well what the doctors said. "I'll do anything. Please don't leave me." But even with her tears and puffy eyes, she couldn't convince Andy to stay. In the end, Andy signed the papers and left her. She spent months crying, hating herself for what had happened. Her heart tortured her, insisting that this was her fault. The pain became too much to bear, but Linda had no other choice but to face it head on. She vowed to make it out of this darkness, even if it was just to spite fate itself. In that overwhelming agony, a new Linda was born. Andy was convinced he'd never see her again. The months after their divorce were bliss for him. He'd outgrown his boyish timidness and had all the money someone like him could ever want. This meant he was surrounded by women from all walks of life. He toured the world and enjoyed life. But deep down, he knew he'd never truly be happy. For a whole year, he endured this new reality. But karma had him in her sights. Karma's swing came out of nowhere, and in 3 sweltering and equally devastating waves. The first wave came in the name of massive layoffs and lawsuits that rocked Andy's company. He and a few of his buddies had been skimming off the top and pocketing company funds. When word got around, the hammer fell hard. Andy found himself without a job and facing the full extent of the law, which quickly paved the way for karma's second wave. This wave was a massive repossession of his properties that he couldn't continue paying for, because all his assets were frozen. From his car and house to the little investments he'd made all over town, everything melted in a span of a month. The third wave was a grave doctor's call. Andy had visited him earlier, complaining about burning in his private areas and a frightening loss of weight. The call wasn't the best, and Andy would need to survive on medication for the rest of his life or greet an early grave. But it didn't stop there. Janice, Andy's 21-year-old girlfriend, left him for a younger man with money and status, the two things Andy lacked. That afternoon, Andy returned to Austin for a business meeting he hoped would help him get back to his feet. He'd not been there since divorcing Linda and was sure she'd moved towns the same way he did after they went their separate ways. But her perfume filtered into his nose the moment he stepped into the street, its caress as soft as a lover's touch. It lingered in the air long enough for his mind to dredge up memories he'd long sealed away. When he turned, his eyes landed squarely on the woman he'd betrayed all those months ago. She was as radiant as ever, mature yet youthful. Her angelic features called to him as they always did, and he groaned as the skips in his thundering heart tugged at his chest. But Linda wasn't alone. Next to her was an older fellow in an expensive three-piece suit. Even more bizarre were the burly men who looked like bodyguards around him and Linda. But this detail isn't what caught Andy's eye. Andy's sight landed on his ex-wife's fingers as he got closer. He noticed she had a pen in hand and was reading what looked like a contract. But more than that, she sat on one of the restaurant's chairs, not in her wheelchair. A walking stick was propped next to her, which could only mean one thing: Laura had beaten her condition and figured out a way to walk. She turned just as Andy was getting close, her sky-blue eyes locking with his. But they were vacant, free of any emotion. She turned around and signed the paper before her. When Andy got close enough to call her name, she ignored him, focusing on the company next to her. Although Andy had no clue, Laura had fought tooth and nail to where she was. She'd gone to physical therapy, where she beat the odds and returned to her former self. Concurrently, she went back to her old job and begged for it. More than that, she'd worked hard enough and invested all her cash. All that sacrifice had paid off because today she was signing a co-ownership of that very bakery with the man next to her, who was the owner. She smiled as inkjet paper. She wouldn't be here if it weren't for all the pain her ex-husband had put her through.